All right. Let's see. Are we online today? Everything working properly? No feedback, hopefully, as well. Um, how you going? All right. So we're going to move on to video 3. Hello to those who have joined us today. It's nice to see a few people have logged on. So yeah, we're going to continue from where we left off last week. We're going to keep on moving through our room. Yeah, so it's great to see everyone again, and it's great to see some returning people as well. So let's get started, basically. All right. So let's open up our previous file. That's all right. Let's type in. There we are. Room. All right. Cool. We're good to go. Sorry about that. All right. So basically, we're going to flesh out this room even more. We're probably going to work more on the modeling side again today. We're going to add a few things, a few stuff around this little room. We're going to add a window sill. We're going to add some glass. Let's see. So we're just going to take it by ear, basically. So we're basically following the same sort of modeling principles as we were following last week. So this is the cool thing about sort of just playing with 3D. You can kind of just go nuts. Normally you'd have some sort of plan, like a layout or like a sketch. If you're doing something more like official, so if you're working with on a story, or you want to build a certain scene, you'd make a plan, basically. So you'd plan out, you know, what kind of furniture you want in the room, what kind of, setting it's going to be. If it's going to be like a dark setting, a light setting, something, something that has a bit of a mood to it. It's really up to you how you go about it. But for this, because we're basically learning things from scratch, we're kind of just playing things by ear. We're just seeing what kind of tools we can make cool stuff with. And we'll get into that sort of like moody stuff later. So like, lighting and, light, texturing and all that sort of thing. So with that in mind, let's get this window up and running. So we need to add some borders to this window, maybe a shelf as well. We can add a drawer in the corner here. We can add a pot plant, maybe even a picture on the side here. And then we can try, if we have enough time in the day, we can see what we can do about getting up some basic sort of rendering settings as well. So we'll get rid of those colored walls and stuff, and work on building something that looks a little bit more settled and less cartoony. But I'm actually tempted to make this into a more stylized sort of room. So I think we'll probably end up doing that a little bit as we go on. The first thing I want to do, though, is create a camera. So what I want to do, I want to use the camera as a sort of like a viewpoint from which I plan on rendering from. So it gives me the right sort of perspective in which I'm seeing everything from that rendered view. So to create a camera, we just push, let me just turn on my screencast. That's all good. So to create a camera, same as always, Shift A to create a camera. We go down on the panel here, click that, and you'll see by default it gets created at the point of at the 3D cursor as always. So we're going to reset the location of that. So I'm going to push Alt G to reset it. Reset that location, and you can see there's some rotations by default with a camera in Blender. I actually find that kind of annoying. I like to have something that's a little less, something that's more of, pointing forward or, straight. But I'm going to reset that by pushing Alt R, and then I'm going to click on my keyboard. I'm going to tell this thing to rotate forward in 90 degrees. So I'm going to push R, X on the keyboard, and then 90, and that will bring it up forward to 90 degrees. And then I'm going to bring that camera back. All right, so we have something like that. I just have a question here. So for a sketch, if you're planning a scene, would you draw it from multiple perspectives to get a better idea? So honestly, the more information, the better, but it's really up to you. So if you're, let me find you some examples, because I've been working on a short film of my own. So I have some actual examples to show you that I can actually show off with regards to how much detail or stuff like that. So you can plan it from multiple perspectives if you're planning on having a scene where you need to use those multiple perspectives. So if you're, just having a locked off camera and there's no movement, there's not much point in designing the layout from behind the camera. But if you do plan on using that room in multiple angles on the camera, then you'd have to basically create a layout, so to speak. So as an example, let's go through that. Jumping into my project. So my project is called Black Curtain. I have my concepts here. So for instance, in my film, I have a few locations. So in my case, I have the apartment. So this is my main character's apartment. And I do plan on using this room here, mostly this room. Let me just draw on top of it to show you what I'm talking about. So I plan on using this room mostly in the shots, right? But the characters, for instance, I'm planning on having them move into different rooms. Thank you. Into different rooms. So I need to know that when I have my camera here, so when I have my camera here, so pointing at this window, I need to know that if my character wants to go to her bedroom, that she's going to go into this direction. Or if the character is going to the kitchen, I need to know that the character is going to walk in that direction, and it's consistent. Because in my story, they do sort of move around the room, so I need to know where they are. And if I plan on making other films, I do plan on maybe showing this room in the future or this room in the future. So I want to know that they exist, and I have a general plan for them in the future. So that's why you plan stuff like that. If you're doing something more official, if you want to build something with a certain amount of style, or with a purpose basically. But because we're learning from sort of like a basic sort of standpoint, it's best just to have fun with it and see what you can create. And then once you're familiar with those fundamentals of modeling and rendering and all sort of stuff, you can create something that's a bit more planned. But definitely that's one of the that's a good example. Another example that I have just quickly would be this nightclub, and this one's a lot rougher. So this one's more of I use this basically for an animatic. So this one's really rough. I don't plan on really, so in my mind I have a vision of what this thing will look like, and it's going to be pretty dark and crowded anyway. So there's not much point for me, at least, to put too much detail in this sketch. This is more of a compositional thing. So for instance, I know that my character is going to be here. They're going to come through there. They're going to be featured up here. So I need to know that, and this is the back door here. So I know that they're going to be in the back door and the front door at some point. So I need to know that where they're going to be situated, so I don't have any inconsistencies with those camera moves. But that's basically the different perspectives you can give yourself. But there's no such thing as too little detail. But there is such a thing as whether or not you're wasting your time. So just be aware of that if you plan on doing things, and especially if you're doing something that's stylized. You don't want to get too far into the nitty gritty of this texture needs to be perfect in this picture. It's more of okay, how can I make this fun? So that's how I approach things, at least. If I was in a more professional setting, I'd probably be more pedantic, but for me, it's just a matter of time before I get there. But yeah, I'm still working on it at the moment, so that's what my YouTube channel is all about. So that's why I'm making these videos, so I can force myself to build this short film. So I'm about to launch another video in about a day, about texturing or whatever, and that will feature one of the characters. So yeah, more to come soon, but we're still working on that film, so just something to be aware of. Anyway, let's move on to this, and thank you for all the kind words from the comments. Sorry if I don't see them straight away, because I am working on a single screen as always. I need to buy a second monitor. Anyway, so I got my camera here and I want to look through it. So to look through it, I need to create another sort of panel. So to create another panel, it's a little bit tricky in Blender. It's not exactly the most obvious thing. See up in the corner there how the screen or the window kind of curves around in the corners? That's actually an opportunity to actually drag out a new window. So to drag out a new window, you just get to this little cross icon here. And then if you're hovering over the corner, you can click and drag. And you can create another window. And this can be a bit tricky. It can sometimes accidentally come down vertically, so you can actually pull one vertically down by accident. So if you end up with a situation where you just keep creating windows in the wrong orientation, you can actually collapse them as long as they're sort of parallel to one another. So if I wanted to collapse these windows, I can click on this line here, right click, and push join areas, and I can join it back up. And now to look through this camera, I want to push 0 on my numpad. So if you don't have a numpad, I think it's tilde view camera. So tilde is a little squiggly line next to the escape key. So view camera, and now I can look through that camera. And as you can see, it's a bit low, and I want to get more of the room into play. So I can drag, using this window, I can drag the camera up. I can drag the camera back. And I might rotate it on the x-axis a little bit down. So, and you can see because it's the same view, it's the same camera, and the view is being replicated in this view. I'm getting a proper sort of view of that scene. And cameras in Blender are all based on real world sort of parameters. So if you're familiar with photography, you should know that lenses have different millimeter lengths and all sort of stuff. So if you're familiar with photography, this would be easier to understand. But the default camera in Blender has a 50mm lens with the assumption that you're using a 35mm sensor or film stock. So that's something to consider. But we won't get into too much detail about that, but that's just worth noting. You can also make it wider or narrower based on the zoom by changing this focal length from a more wide angle being, a smaller number to a more telephoto angle, which is like a higher number, but the default is 50mm. And the reason why it's 50mm is it sort of emulates the human eye's perspective in terms of distortion. So just keep it at the default for now, and we can work from there. I'm just going to save that room file. All right, so with that in mind, I want to sort of block out this outline. So I want to make this black, and so I can only see exactly what I'm seeing through the camera. So to do that, I go to my camera settings here, the little green icon, I go to viewport display, and you'll see this option for Passepartout, and it's basically just a film gate. I don't know why it's French, but it is. We can change the opacity of this gray sort of darkness. So I want to make that completely black. So that way, when I click away, I know exactly what I'm looking at. And it makes it a lot easier to visualize, what's going on and how far into the room, if I'm clipping or not, or whatever. So with that in mind, now I have this room sorted out, I can start modeling. So let's get this window up and running. So to make that window, I want to create a sort of frame around this window. So let's try and just select these edges first. So the edges around the window in edit mode. And then I'm going to set the 3D cursor to the center of that window. So I'm going to set it by pushing Shift S, cursor to selected. So at least I know now that if I create anything around this thing, that it's going to be created around the center of that window. And now there's a few ways we can do this, but I'm going to just create a plane, a simple plane. And then once it's created, I'm going to give it a rotation of 90 degrees in the X in this little add plane section. And then I'm just going to go into edit mode straight away and bring that back just a little bit so it sits inside that window like so. I'm just going to set that to global at the moment. All right, so that's sitting inside that wall quite nicely. And as you can see right now, I can't see the actual plane that clearly, but if I go to wireframe mode, I can see it. If you want to make it more visually appealing, so you want to see what the color, give these different objects random colors, you can go to the viewport shading settings and change it to random. At least then we can see the different objects as different colors. So what I want to do is basically roughly bring down these edges to sort of sit just above and below the window. I'm not going to take it too technical at the moment because this is more of a stylized room, so we don't have to worry too much about all that, measurements and all sort of stuff. So let's not worry too much about that for this project. This is more of a fun thing to do. And then I want to create the sort of window sill effect. Oops, sorry. So I'm going to actually inset a face. So using this face and face select, I'm going to push I on the keyboard, and I'm going to inset a face. So you end up getting almost like a frame automatically. So I'm going to keep insetting until it's just beyond the bounds of that window. And then I'm going to delete that middle face. So X on the keyboard and then push delete faces. So now we only have this edge loop. So to select that edge loop, you can push Alt, click, and you can basically get the selection. And now we can either extrude out the window sill by pushing E, or we can add a solidify modifier to do that. In this case, I'm just going to extrude it. So to extrude, I can either use the tool here. So I can use the extrude tool. So that one is here, extrude region. And then I just pull that out until I'm happy with that. If I go back to my shaded view, you'll see that I've created a basic sort of frame around that window, and that will do for now. So there's our frame. So now let's add a little bit of a shelf underneath this this windowsill. So again, I'm just going to select this bottom edge. I'm going to set the 3D cursor to that edge, and then I'm going to create another plane. And you can see it's kind of created at the perfect spot. And now I'm just going to go straight into edit mode and then manipulate this object, the edges of this object, to create that window sort of shelf. I'm going to scale that. Make sure that if you're having trouble scaling, so I'm having trouble scaling, it's because I got individual origins turned on. But if I switch it back to bounding box center, I can scale it as I need to. Oops, that's a bit too much. Scale it in like so. And then again, I want to extrude another region out of the bottom here. So I'm going to push the extrude region button again, and I'm going to just bring it down that way. And you may have noticed that the icon switches up or down depending on the normals. So I probably have accidentally inverted the normals on this object, and I'll show you what the normals are just now, because it is important once you get into texturing and materials. It's important to make sure that all your normals are consistent in their direction. So a normal is basically the direction in which the faces are sitting. We talked about that last week, but you can visualize whether or not the normals are facing the right way by clicking on the down here in the viewport overlays and go to face orientation. And as you can see, I've got a few things that have in which their normals are flipped the wrong way. So one is the windowsill, and the other one's the table. So we can switch that back to blue, basically the inverted commas correct way, by clicking on the object, go into edit mode, select everything of that object by pushing A, and then go to mesh, normals, and then push flip. And that will flip those normals back to how they're meant to be oriented. Same with this table. I can go to edit mode, select everything there. In this case, it's just that one little edge. Let's see if it works with that one little edge, because it's just a modified table. Go to mesh, normals, recalculate outside, see what happens. No, that didn't work. Mesh, normals, flip, that didn't work. That's because it's only got the one edge as data. So if we have a look at our modifier and turn that off, it's only got this one little edge to worry about. So we need to apply this table, all the modifiers on this table, to make sure that we can have some geometry to flip those normals with. So we can do that. I'm just going to flip it. I'm just going to apply the modifier on the screw modifier and the bevel modifier. So actually just the screw. The screw will do enough. So just apply the top one. And now you'll see that it's been applied. We now have geometry to play with. So now if we select everything there and go to mesh, normals, flip, we can now flip those normals and it looks correct. And now we can turn off the visualization, turn off the face orientation, and we can move on to the next stage. So let's add some stuff to this room. we can add another chair. So we can actually duplicate this chair in a few ways. We can use the mirror modifier, or we can just duplicate it, or we can create an instance object. So in this case, I might just make an instance object. So to do that, we go to this object that we've selected. Let's rename our stuff first. So as well, when you're making a scene, you want to make sure that it's well organized. So we need to name every object here. So we can rename objects either by double clicking on the object in the outliner, but we can also rename objects by pushing F2 on the keyboard and giving it a name. So in this case, I'm going to say geo for geometry underscore window pane, well, window shelf, enter, and you can see it changes in the outliner. Let's give this one another one. We'll just sort of rename all these quickly. Geo, window, I'm going to call it border, or window frame rather. I'll get this one, geo, wall. And for some reason, the colors of the scene change in the random operator based on the name of the object. So I'm not sure why it does that in Blender, but it just does. It's quickly renaming all these things, and I like to have a prefix on different objects depending on what I'm making. So if I'm making an armature for animation, I'll call it rig. If I'm working with curves, I'll underscore it with curves, all that sort of stuff. So, and geo chair, and last but not least, geo. Oops. Table. And now you can see that because we've named everything, it's nice and easily understood. We can play with those much easier. So let's create an instance object, a copy of this. So what instance objects are, basically, it allows you to copy an object without adding to the calculation of the scene. So basically, instead of you creating basically duplicate objects that have their own data and everything like that, if you create an instance object and you make changes to this particular chair, it will affect the other chair and so forth. So we can actually right click on this, go to ID data, and you should be able to duplicate a copy of that. So let's see, object. If not, you can go to copy objects. All right, so duplicate. So you got duplicate for Shift D. Let's see about adding an instance object. So area link. So object. So let's see, add view. Sometimes I get lost as well. So even if you're working with a software as often as I do, sometimes you just get lost in the software. So if you ever find yourself, getting lost, don't worry. It happens to everyone. So in this case, I can instance to scene. I did it yesterday. See here, duplicate linked. So duplicate linked here in the keyboard is Alt D, but in this case, you can go to Object, Duplicate Linked. And if I duplicate that now, it creates a duplicate. But let's see what happens when I try editing that original chair. So I can still move it around and give it a place in the scene. But if I modify the original one, it should affect the new one as well. So for instance, if I grab these chair feet and move it around, it should duplicate that, but it didn't. Let's have a look. There we go. And as you can see, it's duplicating the actual features of our altered original chair. So you can actually do that by duplicating a linked version of that object. And that saves you the effort of having to recreate materials for this object as well, which is really handy. So if you end up UV unwrapping this chair, it will automatically UV unwrap that chair. So it's good to use linked objects from time to time. All right, so we have two chairs now. That's good to go. Let's add a potted plant in the corner. So let's organize things a bit more now. So we can turn these chairs into their own sort of collection. So we'll add a new collection by pushing M on the keyboard. New collection, let's call it chairs. And now I can hide those for now. I'm gonna hide the table as well. So that's in its own thing already, but we can actually make collections a subset of another collection as well. So you can actually click and drag a collection in the outliner into another into a sort of parent collection. So in this case, I'm putting the chairs into the furniture collection as well. And again, I might do that as well for the table. So now I've got that as another selection, as another collection, and these window stuff can go into the floors and walls stuff as well. So now we have a nice empty room to play with. Let's make a pot plant. All right, so we're just going to reset that 3D cursor back to the center of the world. So let's go to View, 3D cursor. I'm going to reset those rotations as well. And we can make a pot plant using the screw modifier as we did last week, or we can just do it by just modeling it from a box. So let's try doing it from the more traditional way. So let's try doing it manually. So I'm going to create just a circle. I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to reduce the vertices down to 12. Sorry about the background noise. The neighbors are doing some renovations if you hear that. So I'm just going to use 12 verts at the moment. And then I'm just going to pop straight into edit mode so I can see all those points. In this case, I'm going to scale that down. And then I'm going to extrude up some faces. So I'm going to extrude up on the Z. So if you want to lock the extrusion, by the way, let's do that again. You can push extrude. So you have free form at the moment. If you push Z on the keyboard and you lock in that axis, you can lock in the extrusion axis. All right. Let's extrude another one inside. So we're going to extrude and scale towards the inside of this pot. So this top row of edges, I'm going to push Alt and click. And then I'm going to extrude inwards by scaling. So I push E and then S to scale. And you can see I've got a decent base to work with. All right, so I'm going to extrude up again on the Z. So E and then Z, and then just drag up. So I have something like that. And then I'm going to just scale that out. So I have something that kind of looks like a pot. And then it's just about extruding further. Extruding out, scale, extrude up, extrude in, scale. And then I can choose to either extrude down. And notice how it's sort of overlapping. So I need to scale that inwards just a little bit, like so. Now we have a choice. We can choose to sort of fill the gaps in the bottom of that pot, or we can just leave it empty. And it's up to you in terms of how much detail you want to give this thing. And it also depends on if you're working more professionally and you have to limit yourself to a certain amount of polygons. You can reduce your polygons by just not creating polygons for bits that aren't going to be seen. So the perfect example for us is not building this wall. Since we're not going to show we're not going to have the camera inside the room. We're just going to show it sort of like a sitcom set. We're just going to have one wall missing, so we don't need to model that. So the same can be said about this pot plant here. We can just not worry about it. But if we want to add some beveling to the bottom here, we probably should fill it, but we don't have to fill the hole at the top. So let's fill it. Let's extrude from the bottom here. Now you might find it difficult to sort of see everything here. So you can either go into wireframe mode. So you can go to the Z wireframe and you can see what's going on underneath. Or we can do something better, and that's called isolate select. So to isolate select something, you basically hide everything else in the scene and it just focuses on that one object. So to do that, you just push the slash key on your keyboard, or the question mark key, depending on your keyboard, and you can isolate that selection. And you can see that the user perspective in the corner here says it's now local. So it's local view. So that makes it a lot easier to see what's going on all around this object. So we can go back into edit mode, and now we can extrude in that bottom nice and easily. And now we can either choose to grid fill it, so we can grid fill like so, or we can just extrude another line in so like that. And I'm going to merge these verts into the center. So to merge, Alt M, merge the center. And now we basically got our low poly pot plant. And it's looking a little bit too low poly for me, so I want to smooth that out. So I can go to the Modifier tab and add a Subdivision Surface. And you can see that smooths it right out. And you can still see the polygons, so we can actually add a shade smooth operator to this object. And what this shade smooth is different to the subdivision surface is that the shade smooth isn't subdividing the object. It's going to basically smooth out those normals. So based on the way normals work, you can have hard normals or smooth normals. This basically smooths out the normals faces. So to push, to make that happen, W, shade smooth, or right click shade smooth, and you've got a smooth shaded object. Now I might want to harden up these edges here at the corner. So there's a little trick we can do to harden up those edges without adding any new geometry. We can, I'm going to turn off the subdivision surface for now, just to see. Oh, actually, I'll show you by keeping it on, but you can actually turn on the sort of the mesh as it's seen like this by clicking this button here on cage. So it actually gives you a preview of that subdivision based on the way it's averaging out those faces. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click on this edge here. Now look what happens if I harden this edge. So I can actually harden this edge so the subdivision doesn't affect it as much. So if I go to Control E, you'll get an option box. Or if you go right click, in your case, right click or Control E, you'll get this option to add an edge crease. So when you add an edge crease, it actually creases that edge. Look what happens if I push it, Shift E, and I start pulling that value, and it goes pink based on the edge crease. So I can increase that edge crease even further, and it hardens up that edge, so I get a nice hard crease on that pot. So I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom, but in this case I'm just going to push Shift E, sharpen up that, and now you can see it's subdivided it still, but it's hardened up those points where it just looks like a little bit of a pot. A little bit more of a pot, sorry. So now what we want to do, you might notice that now the shading looks a bit stretched. And that's because we're stretching those normals a little bit too much. So now what we need to do is add geometry to this thing. So add a few more edge loops so it sort of evens out those normals. So normals, let me just show you what normals look like, by the way, when you visualize it in 3D. So in the viewport settings here, if you go to face orientation, you can see the red and the blue sort of orientation. But there's another way that's also good for visualizing things. So let's have a look and see where that option is. So normally you can just see the faces just by clicking on iframe. No, sorry, I can't find it right now. But basically it lets you just see the direction in which they're facing. So we'll pop into that soon, but let's just get to subdividing this thing. All right, so let's subdivide this a little bit further up from the box, and you'll see the difference in that shade happen. So to add some more subdivisions, we're going to add some edge loops. So Control R, click, and then just scroll to add 3 or so edge loops, and you can see that the shading is already smoothed out quite a bit. And now I might want to make this look a little bit more bulby. So I'm going to select this middle edge loop, like so. And then I'm going to turn on soft select, proportional editing. And what this does is pretty cool. So based on the distance of your cursor from the distance from these selected objects, it will affect other non-selected portions of the mesh. So let me demonstrate. So I select it on, And based on me scrolling up or down on my mouse, I get a little circle icon. And the more I make the circle bigger, the more it affects the influence. So I'm going to make it sort of like that. And select. And now I can turn off that soft select. And now we have a nice bulby looking pot plant base. If you have any questions, feel free to post them on the chat. I'll be able to answer it as soon as I see them. Let's have a look at that normal thing first again. So if we go into edit mode, we have to go into face orientation selection first, I think. And if we go to, yep, that's right. So to view the normal direction, all you got to go to is make sure you have your face detect selection turned on. Select the faces or whatever. You don't actually have to select anything really, as long as you have face selection turned on. And if you go to mesh analysis and you see all these different things, you can turn on normals. So in this case, I can turn on the face normals, and you can see that the faces have a direction to them. And normally they should be pointing outwards from your model, outwards in a consistent manner. So let me just turn on that thing, turn off that preview again. If I go back into edit mode, you can see the direction of those normals. And you can make the visualization more easier to see by changing the size. And you can see they all have a direction. And this is really important when we get to shading and other kinds of modeling techniques, because depending on the way that your normals are facing, it does affect things, especially with modifiers. All right, so I can turn off that visualization again. Let's just turn that off. And let's place, before we do that, before we place it into the corner of that room, let's add a plant. So I'm going to add some leaves, basically, like a shrubby sort of leaf plant. So let's reset that 3D cursor again back to that object. So select the object, go to S, Shift S, cursor to selected, and we're going to create a leaf, so to speak. All right, so let's create another plane. And like I said, most complex objects are born out of very simple shapes. So in this case, a leaf, in my case, is just going to be made out of a plane yet again. And this is basically the pattern in which I work for the most of my time, unless I'm sculpting. And we may get into sculpting in the future, but for now, let's keep it simple. So I'm going to select this plane. I'm going to rotate it on the X 90 degrees. And we're going to bring that up. And then I'm going to just shrink down the bottom right down to sort of a tip of sorts. I'm going to shrink down the top one as well. And then I'm going to add an edge loop like so. And just sort of get it into a sort of leafy shape. So I'm going to keep adding edge loops. Just enough to play with, basically. For now. So that looks kind of leafy. And that will do. And now, let's just subdivide that. So it's nice and smooth. And now it really looks like a leaf. That's pretty cool. Sorry. Need some water. All right. So let's get this leaf looking a bit more leafy. So we can use that soft select again. So by using the soft select, we can grab that top of that leaf, turn on the soft select, and now we can just drag it. And we'll increase that a little bit further, like so. And the cool thing is that soft select actually works in rotations as well. So you can actually rotate that so you can get a bit of a smooth bend going on. And I'm just going to rotate it like so. Just so I have something kind of natural looking like that. And I'm going to turn on smooth shading again on that object. And then we can add some thickness to this by adding a solidify modifier. So I'm going to make it a little bit thick, just a little bit, like so. And you've noticed that the normals have now gone funny again. And that's because the way that modifiers work in Blender is it works in a stack. So one affects the other, or is affected by the other, is affected by the other. So in this case, the solidify modifier on top of the, beneath the subdivision surface, it's acting on the geometry generated from the subdivision surface. So look what happens when I put the solidify modifier on the top of that stack above the subdivision surface. It smooths out in a different way. And depending on how many subdivisions I have on the subdivision surface, it smooths it out even further. So depending on how you build your modifier stack is also important, because it does affect it a lot. So in this case, I'm going to have the solidify on top. I'm going to give it a bit more thickness like that, so it looks a little bit more natural. And that will do for a leaf for now. And I might scale that down first, just a little bit like so. And then I'm going to apply the transforms on that as well. And notice how it just glitched a little bit when I applied the transforms. Is because I reduced the scale of that object, and then I applied the scale. The solidify modifier is affected by applied scale, so you can re-thin that up a little bit like so. Now I need to create multiple leaves, so I can do it in a pretty interesting way. We can use we can use more modifiers, but we need to create one object first, which is a control object to rotate some leaves around in order to make that work. So let's add a empty. So I'm going to add an empty with some, let's make it a sphere, just so it's easy to see. Just leave it at that. Same place where the leaf is created. So just to leave it empty like so. And then we're going to add let's try an array. So we're going to add an array. And we're going to have an offset object for that array. So we're going to have, see how we can create multiple objects with just an array like that. So you increase the count with an array modifier, and it makes it one by one next to each other. In this case, I want to have it offset around a particular object. So in this case, the empty. So let's give that a go. Select the offset object like so. And let's see what happens when I manipulate this empty. We're mad. So it's working pretty good. We're basically creating a stacked little leaf setup. Let's add a few more leaves. In this case, I'm going to keep it at maybe 9 or 8. Let's go 8. And then just offset it like so. And as you can see, the reason why it's not quite centered around that pot properly is because it's pivoting based on the rotation of this object here. So you'd think that just by moving it around, it will affect the offset, but it does in a different way. It basically changes the radius of that offset. So we can't do that, but we will just, we'll play with that in a second. But what we can do is play with scale. And look what happens when we change the scale. We can sort of get like a sort of staggered scale effect, which is kind of cool. And we can affect the offset by going to edit mode into our leaf and basically dragging in the leaf to be more centered, like so. So we get something that looks a little bit like that. And then you can sort of play with, and you can see it just affects the way that the leaf is made, basically. So you can, by editing that that original mesh, you're affecting the array, how it behaves. So in this case, I might just keep it like that. And because I'm happy with that, for instance, I might scale it down a little bit further, just so we have a bit more variation like that. And then I might make that leaf feel a little bit more droopy. So I'm going to sort of turn off soft select. I might droop that down a little bit further like that. So it's sort of like this. That looks all right. Yeah, soft select are mad. It's super, super useful, and it gets even more useful the more you get used to it. So especially when you're modeling faces, massive difference. It's really useful. And there's a few tricks I'll show you with soft select after we make this plant. So we got this plant. I'm happy with that sort of setup. I might duplicate this as a backup. So I'm going to duplicate that and hide it, because I might change some parameters on that original piece and I want to have a backup, because I need to apply this first. I need to apply this object, all these different things. So in this case, with the array, I might put that back on top as well, because I need to affect it differently. All right, so I'm going to apply the array, and then I'm just going to replace this object, because now it's all just one mesh. It's been applied, the array's been applied. I'm going to apply that mesh. I'm going to select everything in that mesh and just bring it into the pot like so. I might just bring it down like that, so it sort of sits like so. And the reason why I want to make an alternate version is because I want to use the other one. So I'm going to bring that back as sort of like an extra layer of plants, so I can make a more varied sort of plant object. And I can scale that up so it does something like that. I can change the leaf on this one to be a bit different to the other copy. So in this case, I might even give it a little bit more information. So I can do something like that, and you can see you can visualize it in the second viewport as well. And I might make it more bulby at the front, like so. And this is why modifiers are so useful. All right, so we have our second option. Actually, let's bring that up a little bit so it has a little bit more spring to it, or appears to have a bit more spring. So I'm going to grab these two, add the soft select. So it's sort of like that. And I'm going to affect the scale on that controller again, so we have a bit more variation again. So click on that empty. That way it looks a bit like that. And then I'm going to apply that array again, like so. And now I don't need this empty anymore, because I've done enough with that array. And now I'm going to scale that into place. So it feels a little bit more natural. I'm going to sort of rotate that like so. I'm going to bring it up. And because I applied the array, I can no longer sort of manipulate every piece, but I can add variation by using the soft select. So I can soft select that particular leaf. I can rotate that up. And this is where the different functions of soft select come into play. So there's two different flavors of soft select. There's connected only, turned on or off. So connected only basically says that if these meshes are separate objects, the soft select won't affect the separate objects, right? Even in the same mesh. But if I turn off connected only, it treats the entire object as a single piece of mesh, and it can affect entire parts of that object. So I think that will do for that plant. I might actually bring in some pieces there. I'm going to turn on connected only. So you can connect an entire, you can select an entire separate piece by pushing L on the keyboard by hovering over a mesh, and then you can just bring that into place. So I'm just going to play with the scale of things. I'm going to scale up one leaf so it looks a bit more different. I'll grab another leaf, I'll scale that one up. Oops, like so. And you can see how like playing with these different, like just fiddling with like the design of things could take ages. Like you may understand the principles of doing modeling techniques, but it's about training your eye to know what looks good and what doesn't look good, or what suits the scene that you're creating. So sometimes it's not the modeling process that's difficult, it's the actual design process. So be aware of that when you are, when you're learning. Like good design is everything, even with natural design. So, but in this case, I think that will do for now. That's a good enough plant. And now I'm going to sort of parent all these objects into a single object so I can have it as sort of like a control. So I am going to bring back a new empty. So I'm going to bring back that sphere. I'm going to parent these objects under that empty. So to do that, select everything, then select the empty, push Control P, parent to object, and now we can manipulate the whole thing as one. I forgot to add the pot, so I'll do that too. So there you go. We can now place that somewhere in the room. Let's rename these first before we move on. If you don't see it in the outliner, it's because it's now buried underneath that empty. So to find it in the outliner, you can also push slash on your keyboard. Sorry, not slash, full stop on the keyboard to bring it into view. So pushing the full stop will bring it into view on the keyboard. By the way, I forgot to tell you, to get out of local view, you just push the slash button again in the viewport. So let's rename this thing. We're going to rename this as GeoPot. Geo leaves 01. Oh, make sure that's Blender likes having a full stop then the number, so something like that. So follow that convention and your life will be easier. Leaves.002. And there we go, nice and organized. So let's have a look at there. And now we have a windows, we have our window pane, we have a window frame. Now we need to add some glass to that window. So let's add a cursor to selected. And this one's just very simple, just a single plane. Rotate 80 degrees, 90 degrees, sorry, and then just scale it into place. And just have it sit behind that solidify modifier. So there we go. That's all you need for that window. All right, now let's bring back everything that we made. So we got our chairs, we got our table, and now we have a nice little room going on. Now, before we wrap up today, let's do some rendering settings. So we're going to use Eevee for this for now. So Eevee is the real-time renderer. And it's a pretty fun renderer to work with because it's real-time and it can, it's a pretty low intensity sort of rendering engine. So let's have some fun with that. So what we have here, we don't have any lights in here yet. So let's build a light source first. So I'm going to create a light. So I'm going to go area light, and I'm just going to create a light and just sort of put it somewhere here above the room. That'll do for now. And I'm going to scale it up just to have something to work with. And now let's pop into our render settings. So viewport shading, we're going to go to rendered. And as you can see, the light's pretty weak at the moment, so we need to increase the strength of that light. Let's go to the light settings. So the little green icon here with the light icon, and we can change the power from 10 to maybe, I don't know, 200. That looks a bit brighter. That's nicer. All right, and you can see it's sort of glitching out, but it's just processing that light information. All right, so there's a few things we need to tweak in Eevee to make this look nicer. So to do that, let's increase the shadows. So we're going to improve the shadows. So in the shadow settings of that light, we can turn on contact shadows. And that will increase. You see how you notice how here, around here, the shadow changes? Contact shadows are really important. All right. And now let's go into our render settings. And we're going to turn on a few things. We're going to turn on ambient occlusion. And this one sort of does fake shadowing around certain contact points of certain objects. So we're going to turn that on. We're going to increase the distance a little bit. And it's hard to show, but when you turn on ambient occlusion, let's just go into the viewport shading to show you how that looks. If you turn that on, it adds shadowing around objects, and it gives it more of a natural sort of interface between different objects. So cranking it up to around 1 meter or 2 meters is probably about right. So in this case, I'm going to go 1.5 meters. The next thing we need to turn on is bloom. So this actually turns on some highlights. So if you look at the highlights, you'll see that it kind of gives that little bit of a glow. If we decrease the threshold, it makes it less, it makes it even more prominent. And we can change the intensity or not. All right. And then we're going to turn on screen space reflections. So if we have reflections turned on, we'll get reflections. So notice how when I turned on the screen space reflections, it went yellow a little bit. It's actually reflecting from the wall and the table. Let's turn that on and you'll see it looks pretty good there. And now the reason why it's probably glitching for me is because I'm live streaming, but it shouldn't be glitching like that in your case. All right. And we're going to turn on some soft shadows, make sure that's turned on, and high bit depth, and that will be fine. And now, because we have this window open, if I push F12 to render this image, it will render from this camera view. Now let's have a look and see how that looks. So far it's looking pretty nice. There's a few, the quality of the shadows aren't perfect because we're working with fairly low resolution at the moment, but that's all right. We can increase the render resolution to 128. Push F12 again. And it's looking a little bit cleaner. So let's add a few things. Let's make this floor shiny. So with this floor selected, we're going to add a new material. And the materials, we'll get into more detail tomorrow, but basically, next week, but basically we need to decrease the roughness of our material so it's more shiny. And we're going to change the color. Let's make the color darker. Maybe, let's go with a gray for now, just to show you how that looks. And if we decrease the roughness, we start getting more reflections in that. So let's give it a little bit more reflectivity and leave it like that. With the glass, this one's a little bit different. We need to add a glass shader. So we can do that by pushing new. We can either use the principal BDSF, so let's just use that for now. And if we go down to transmission, so transmission is like glass, increase that number to 1. And right now it looks a bit, it doesn't look like it's doing much, but if we add an object behind it, let's add an object and make that a different color. Give that, let's imagine that's a tree at the front. So now you can't see it. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason is that we need to turn on refraction, screen space refraction in the material settings. So with that window turned on or selected, turn on this little button in the material settings, click that. And again, nothing's happening because the roughness is too high. Let's bring that roughness down. Okay, so it's starting to reflect the inside of the room, but it's not showing what's outside the room. That's because we need to go to the render settings again. Go to screen space reflections, open up that tab and turn on refraction. And now we can see through that window. So that'll do for now. Now let's add a few more things before we wrap up. Let's make the plant green. Let's add some leaf colors. Click on that leaf. Click on new. Let's make that leaf color green. Something like that, something fresh. And you can either copy the material from this plant to this plant by click and dragging on this little icon, and you can click it and drag it to the other object. Or you can select the object you want the material to have. Select on the object with the material, and then go to this tab here and push copy material to select it, and that will do the same thing. Or if you want to have its own material, in which case I do, I might give it another color. I'm going to make a new material and make it a different shade of green. Like so. I'll give that pot plant a color as well. Maybe something warm like terracotta. And we have something like that. And then let's add some color to these windows. So I actually don't mind the yellow walls, but so let's keep it like that. Let's make this window color, the window sill, a different color though. Let's give it an orange color, just something like that. And we'll do the same for the skirts, the window shelf, and this window thing here. And then we can actually copy the material to all these different objects that we selected. So we do that now by pushing this little tab here, copy materials were selected, and now it's all one material. I might make this table now the same material as these chairs. So I can do that by clicking on the table, clicking on the chairs, copying the material to selected, and now it's all blue. So let's give that a render and see how that looks. F12. And that's looking kind of fun and colorful and childish, but that's all right. We can start adding some extra features to that next week. There's a few issues you can tell. So the leaves are actually going through the wall. So we need to fix that up. So let's move that plant away from the wall a little bit further. Or we can edit those plant leaves so they just sit across on the wall. So let's actually do that. So let's select this leaf that's sticking outside. Let's just go into our regular view. I'm just going to use soft select in this case. Connected only. And I'm just going to bring those in like so. I'm going to select this plant here, bring that one in as well. And of course the one down the back as well. And now let's have a look again. And that's looking better, much better. So today we've added we added the windowsill, we've done a pot plant, we've added some leaves, we've done some rendering settings, some basic rendering settings. So I think that will do for today. It's already been an hour, it goes so quickly. Before we go, does anyone have any questions? So modifiers, yes. Let's go through some questions. So modifiers, I wouldn't say that they're exclusive to Blender. There's different ways in which modifiers work in different software. So in Maya, modifiers don't exist as they are in Blender. They don't. But Maya does have something called object history. So it's not really procedural, but it kind of remembers what you do to a mesh as you edit it. And it's really finicky. 3ds Max is probably the closest you'll get to a similar workflow to Blender. So it has basically the same thing, modifiers. They just operate in a different way. So Blender's quite unique in that regard. And then Cinema 4D has something called Effectors, and they kind of do something similar to what modifiers do, but it's a lot more freeform in a weird way. It's a different way of approaching it. It doesn't. It's on a per object basis. Yeah, it's hard to explain with Cinema 4D, but you have to see it to understand. But yeah, there are different ways of doing procedural modeling in other software. With Maya, it's less capable of doing that. What else is there? Any other questions before we head off? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap it up for today, and I'll upload this in the next couple of days on YouTube as well. So if you want to keep up or look back at some of this work, you can come back to the video, have a look and copy it, or do whatever you need to do to move on to the next week. So next week, sorry, I'm getting dry mouth. Next week, we'll add a few more things to this room, and we may get into some basic texturing and more material stuff, because you'd be surprised how much you can do with YouTube. Not YouTube. I'm reading the comments and getting all mixed up. You'd be surprised what you can do with just materials and texturing with such simple objects as these. Texturing is everything to get the right look. So until then, I think we'll wrap it up. So catch us later. Thank you for watching. It's great to see everyone pop on and come back every week. It's really nice to see. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, so thank you. All right, I'll see you soon.